I have a very sincere hope up here. My very sincere hope is that I brought my notes. If not, I'll wing it, but here we are. I might begin by mentioning one thing, and that is that there is another table out there that Dr. Schultz has generously shared with me. And as I mentioned, I am chairman of the board of the Plymouth Rock Foundation. This is established in Plymouth to promote the vision of the Pilgrims, a biblical vision for America. We have quite a number of materials there that I would urge you to look at, and some that can be purchased, but I'd also urge you to sign up on our mailing list. There's a sheet that I've set out there. Put on your email. You can be on our mailing. We have monthly messages that we send out with the Plymouth Rock Foundation. We have conferences that we put on at Plymouth. But anyway, I'd encourage you strongly, sign up there. It's no charge, and you can take your name off our list anytime you wish to. Let's just imagine that you're at home. There's a knock on the door, and there's a rather tough-looking guy there, and he's got a couple companions with him, and he's carrying what looks like a violin case, but you kind of suspect that there's not a violin in it. And he says, "You better pay up." Well, why? "Because we want you to pay." Well, why should I be paying you? "Because of what we do for you." Well, what do you do for me? "Well, we keep your place safe. You see, if you don't pay up, you could have an accident, or your house might burn down. You better pay up." Are you going to pay him? Well, if you're worried about your family or others' safety, you might have a difficult dilemma, but you would pay certainly with your teeth clenched and paying under a very strong protest. Now let's suppose the same scenario takes place, except for one thing. The guy is wearing a badge. It says police, or maybe it says U.S. Internal Revenue Service. Does that change the picture? What makes that any different? Somebody said something, I couldn't quite hear you. What did you say? It symbolizes safety. Yes, that's one of the purposes of government, but yes. They have authority, exactly. There was a movie, I think it was probably back in the 1980s or thereabouts. It was called Married to the Mob, and it was about some wives of mafia gangsters. There's one scene where they're having a reception of some kind, and all of a sudden, FBI agents break in. And these FBI agents, basically, they start brutalizing the mobsters there, the mafia figures, and taking them in to be arrested. And one of the wives just gets incensed about this, and she is yelling at one of these FBI agents, "What makes you any different from them?" He said, "There's all the difference in the world. They are thieves and murderers. We work for the president." When that movie came out, that wasn't even supposed to be funny. But what makes one mob or one group of thugs different from the other? And as you say, they have authority. In Romans 12, we read the words, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." But in Romans 13, Paul goes on to speak about governmental authority. And when he says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," he's telling us that we are not to avenge ourselves. But then he is saying in Romans 13 that God has delegated a portion of that authority to execute vengeance, and he's delegated a portion of that authority to civil government. And so we read in Romans 13, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So here we see a strong obligation to obey civil government. But would you obey a government that is evil, that is sinful, that is socialistic, that is pagan? Well, ask Paul that question. We don't have a copyright date on the book of Romans, but it's believed to have been written somewhere around 58 to 60 AD. And it is written to, well, who is the book of Romans written to? Good. Next, who's buried in Grant's tomb? But yes, to Christians who are living in the city of Rome, and has a broader application of all, but that's the immediate audience. 58 to 60 AD, who was the emperor at this time? Nero. Nero was anti-Christian. He considers himself to be a Greek god. He's also an incompetent. He is a man who hates Christians, a man who persecutes Christians. In fact, Nero even had a practice sometimes that he would take Christians, wrap them in oil-soaked rags, and set them afire and use them as the torches for his garden parties. Insane, probably, perhaps demon-possessed, and yet he is the emperor when Paul is telling Christians in Rome to submit themselves to the higher powers. And the reason he says to do so, though, is that they are avengers upon those who do evil. God has given them that authority. And this civil ruler is the minister or servant, that is, servant of God for good. The word diakonos, the same word we use for servant, but for good. And so you'll have reward from government if you do that which is good, do evil, and you will incur the wrath that this government, to whom God has given authority, will impose upon you. There is a pretty strong command to obey civil government. However, in that passage, Paul assumes that government is following its laws, that these are good, sound laws, and that government is rewarding good and punishing evil. What happens when government starts punishing evil, or rather rewarding evil, and punishing good? Paul doesn't address that here, but he will at other times, and there are times when Paul is imprisoned for his faith, and of course Paul is ultimately a martyr for his faith. And then we turn to what is sort of a parallel passage in chapter 2 of 1 Peter, where Peter says, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as to them who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men." There were all sorts of rumors being circulated among Christians that they considered themselves above the law, that they sought to overthrow the civil authority, and so on. And Peter is saying, how do you silence these rumors? By conducting yourselves as law-abiding, model citizens. And here we see not only are we talking about the higher powers, here we're talking about the lower powers as well. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. The king is supreme, governors, and he would take this all the way down to the local police chief and the city council and all those who have been given this authority of civil government. God has established these kingdoms, church and state. I'll talk more about those this afternoon. But he has established both of these kingdoms. And what Luther used to call the kingdom of the left, government, and kingdom of the right, the church, and he used those terms before left and right had any ideological or political significance. But God has established the church to proclaim the word. He has established the state to preserve order. And so there is a need, a duty of ours, to obey civil government. But that is not an absolute, as we clearly see and yes, Dr. Schultz, I do believe there are absolutes. But obeying civil government is not one of them. Consider, for example, Acts 5:29. In Acts 5:29, the disciples are told that they may not preach the word of God, and they respond, we ought to obey God rather than men. So there are times when government commands us to do what God's word forbids, or forbids us to do what God's word commands, there are times then that we must choose to obey God rather than men. A good example of this is way back in the book of Exodus, chapter 1. If you have your Bibles, you might want to turn to this passage. And in this passage, we see that the Pharaoh has commanded the midwives that they are to slay the male Hebrew children when they are born. But we read in verse 17 of chapter 1, but the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Okay? Here they've disobeyed civil authority. And their reason for disobeying civil authority, as we see in verse 17, is because they fear God. And when the Pharaoh asked them why, they answer with something that probably is a bit of a half-truth. Well, the Hebrew women, they give birth so fast that they have their children put away from us before we can even get to them. So that's why we haven't obeyed you. If you read the Geneva Bible, which is the Bible that the Pilgrims used, if you read the Geneva Bible, one of the things that is one of the most valuable about the Geneva Bible, and one of the things that the Stuart kings, like James I, hated, was the notes in it. Because the note in the Geneva Bible says that their disobedience was commendable, but their dissembling, that is, their lying to the Pharaoh, was not. I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I don't think they could have continued their practice of saving the Hebrew children had they been completely forthright with the king as to their reason. But in both respects, we see in verse 20, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives fear God, that he made them houses, that is, he gave them families of their own. So here we see a clear act of civil disobedience. And based on the fear of God and God commending them for their act of disobedience. Possibly the best text that you can possibly find out of the Bible for how we deal with civil government in matters like this would be the book of Daniel. I love the book of Daniel. In fact, I'll be teaching the book of Daniel again for Chafer Theological Seminary this fall, and if you're interested in that, just check out Chafer Theological, C-H-A-F-E-R. Chafer was an author of an 8-volume systematic theology and was the founder of Dallas Theological Seminary. But anyway, check out their website, Chafer Theological Seminary, and you can enroll if you have an interest in any of their classes, either audit or credit, either one. But anyway, we look at Daniel, and Daniel is the perfect model of what a believer is to do when he's living in a secular or a pagan, or in this case, we might say a post-Christian society. Here he is, a pious young Jewish lad who comes from a noble family and is taken captive to Babylon. Sometimes I say taken to this city of the East to be indoctrinated in 3 years of public education, to be prepared to be a servant of the New World Order. And that's essentially what happened to Daniel. Here he is, after Nebuchadnezzar has conquered Jerusalem. He's taken these youths to Babylon, putting them through 3 years of indoctrination in Babylonian law, Babylonian custom, Babylonian language, Babylonian religion, preparing them to be servants of this New World Order, which was the basic practice of Babylon. Whenever they would conquer a people, they would move them around, they'd do everything to break them away from their traditional roots and try to mold them into this big Babylonian melting pot. We find the Persians had a very different policy, decentralized government, and that's why after 70 years of captivity, Cyrus of Persia allows them to return home. But anyway, we find Daniel faces a number of conflicts with authority, and it's interesting the way he deals with them. Right there in chapter 1, we see 2 conflicts. The first conflict is they rename each of these Hebrew youths and give them pagan names instead. Daniel means God is my judge. Oh, we're going to change that. We're going to change that to Belteshazzar, the prince of Baal. And Daniel's friends have their names changed as well. Now, we don't read that they necessarily identified with those names, but they don't raise any resistance at that point. But then another issue comes up. They're given the king's meat, Chateaubriand, probably every night, and the king's wine. And we read that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. What's wrong with this? Well, in some way, this violates Jewish dietary laws, and so Daniel determines, I have to take a stand here. They can call me what they want to call me, but I can't compromise on the principle of following Jewish law. So what does he do? Does he just simply say to the captain of the guard, I'm not going to eat any of your pagan slop? No. We read that he speaks to the captain of the guard about his objection. Now, we read something else interesting. We're told that God has put Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs, or captain of the guard. In other words, the captain of the guard has come to like and respect Daniel personally. He knows Daniel is not a troublemaker. He knows that if Daniel has an objection to this diet, it is a sincere and serious objection, and so he's willing to listen. There is a principle of dealing with civil authority. Conduct yourself as a model citizen. And then, when you have a grievance, the authorities are more likely to listen to you because they know that you're not just a troublemaker. And so, Daniel, in turn, listens to the captain of the guard. The captain of the guard says, look, I'm responsible for all you kids and all your health. And if you eat this Jewish diet of yours, you might get sick. And I might lose my job. In fact, I might even lose my head. Daniel could have been utterly non-compromising about this, but he is not. Rather, Daniel tries to work out the conflict. How does he work it out? Anybody recall? Go ahead. Okay, in other words, he proposes a test. Put us on this Jewish diet just for 10 days. I mean, we can't get too sick in 10 days, can we? And then, at the end of the 10 days, see how we are compared to the others, and then act accordingly. And the captain of the guard agrees. At the end of the 10 days, they are the healthiest of the lot, and so they're allowed to continue. Now, I wonder what would have happened if they had gotten sick during that time, and if, as a result, the captain of the guard said, okay, sorry, we tried it, it didn't work. You've now got to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine. What would Daniel have done then? I don't know. I'm going to ask Daniel that when I see him in heaven, and I think I know what his answer is going to be. He says, he'll probably say, I don't know what I would have done. I was only 15 years old at the time. He shows remarkable poise for a young youth there who's been taken captive into a pagan land. And then we read in chapter 3, where after the interpretation of of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Nebuchadnezzar builds this huge image. Originally, in the dream, the head of gold was Babylon, but he makes the whole image of gold, which may just mean gold-plated, but he makes that whole image of gold. And then he calls all of the leaders from all over the empire to come to the dedication of this statue and of the playing of Hail to the Chief. They all have to prostrate themselves before it, bow before it, and worship it. Daniel is not mentioned in chapter 3, but his three friends are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they refuse. This time there is no compromise. You can't just say, well, how about if we just bow at the waist? Would that be okay? No, that wouldn't have been acceptable to Nebuchadnezzar, and it certainly wouldn't have been acceptable to God. But the king seems to want to save their lives, so he says, let's try it again. I bet maybe this is the problem. You were foreigners. You didn't really quite understand what the command was. Well, this time, you're going to have to do it. So we'll play Hail the Chief. This time, you'll fall down and worship, and we'll just forget this ever happened. And they say, nope, that's not going to work for us. They say, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us, O king. I've heard people say that that is the strongest statement of faith in the entire Old Testament. I suggest that it isn't. The strongest statement of faith comes in the next verse. But if not, we will still not worship your gods, which is exactly what this statue is. It is a symbol of state worship and emperor worship. We will still not serve your gods. What they're saying is, we know God is able to deliver us. We believe he will deliver us. But even if he doesn't deliver us, we are still going to be faithful to God, and we will not worship your pagan image. And of course, they're placed in the fiery furnace. And being in the fiery furnace, they are delivered by the fourth man of the furnace, who Nebuchadnezzar says is like the Son of God. Again, this is probably a pre-incarnate appearance of our Lord Jesus Christ. Well, then we see another example. And this comes in chapter 6. I could go through so much more here, but our time is not permitting. By the way, what time do we end here? 3 in the afternoon? 10, okay, I've got some time yet then. Okay, but let's go on to chapter 6. Now, there in chapter 6, the Persians have taken over. Their policies are different. And King Cyrus has taken his father-in-law, who the father-in-law is a Mede, and Cyrus has married his daughter and then has conquered him. And some of you are probably thinking about marriage in the near future, perhaps, or you know that's in the horizon for you. Men, I'm just going to give you some advice. Don't conquer your father-in-law. That doesn't generally promote good family relations. But if you do conquer your father-in-law, do something nice in return. And so King Cyrus does that. He takes this father-in-law, Darius, and he says, how would you like to be king over this new province that I've just conquered, Babylon? I'll make you king over it. And so he does. And so Darius, following Persian and Median policy, divides this new kingdom of Babylon into 70 satrapies or districts or states, and puts a prince or satrap over each one of them, 70 of them. And then he has 3 presidents to govern over them. One of those 3 presidents is Daniel. And he's very impressed with the way Daniel is performing his duties, and so he wants to set Daniel as prime minister over all of them. But now there's some resentment, possibly because Daniel is Jewish. And anyway, so the presidents and the princes get together, and they say, we're going to see what we can do to get rid of Daniel. Here's what we'll do. Let's go through the records, and we'll find some scandal in Daniel's life that we can dismiss him for. We'll find some way that he's been immoral. Maybe he's been stealing money from the government and so on. Maybe he's been padding his expense accounts. Maybe he's been making personal phone calls on the official state telephone system. But they check the records, and they find that he has conducted himself with complete integrity. They look to see, is there anything, maybe some project that he's bungled somewhere? No. He has conducted himself with professionalism and with integrity. And so they say, we shall find nothing against this Daniel unless we find it concerning the law of his God. Consider this now. If you conduct yourself with professionalism and integrity, you force your opponents to address the real issue, which is your relationship with God. That's exactly what's happening here. Because they can't find any other way to dismiss Daniel, what they have to do is they have to manipulate things to put Daniel in a position where he has to choose between obeying God or obeying man. And so they come up with this stupid order, this order that says for the next 30 days, everybody has to ask everything of directly the emperor, the king himself. No one can ask anything of any man or any god except you. Now, King Darius, all the presidents and princes have agreed that you should sign this order. Now, that's an outright lie. Daniel is the first of the presidents, and he hasn't agreed. How many others haven't? Tactic there many times to try to pretend you have unanimity or greater strength when you don't. Our enemies are great at doing that. Sometimes we need to do it. You know, I found when we come to a gathering, like maybe a protest to the state library board or the Board of Education, some policy going on, what Christians usually do is they'll sit all together over in one corner and stand up to raise their objections, and it looks like just a little fringe group over there. The communists had a tactic for taking over labor unions and things like this. What they would do is, as they're raising objections, they'd have somebody planted right over here, and he'd stand up and say something. Somebody over here would stand up and say the thing. Somebody in back would stand up and say it. Looks like the whole crowd is rising up, which maybe it's only a few. But anyway, this is what they've done, that all the presidents and princes have agreed that you should sign this decree, and Darius signs it. Well, he's going to have a pretty busy next 30 days, isn't he? But now we read that Daniel knew that the order was signed, and the word there means thorough knowledge. Consider this. Daniel, by this time, is about 80 years old. He's a seasoned politician, a seasoned servant of government, a seasoned statesman. He not only knows that it's been signed, he knows why it's been signed. And they put him in the position that he has to choose to either obey God, to pray to God, or obey this order to serve the government. And he chooses to serve God. We read the first thing he does is goes up to his chambers, his windows being open. And he knows they're watching him. He knows what they're going to do. But he disobeys, and he disobeys openly. Oh, he could have closed the windows and could have said, well, Darius likes me, and I'm 80 years old. I don't need any of this nonsense right now. I'll just pray with the windows shut a few times, and nobody will be able to prove anything. In a couple of years, I can retire and get out of here. But he doesn't. He disobeys openly. And as a result, he is taken and put in the den of lions. Anybody know why Darius uses a den of lions instead of using a fiery furnace? Persians were Zoroastrian, and they identified a god that they worshiped called Ahura Mazda. And Ahura, and yes, the word Mazda for the car, that does come out of the Persian language there, but Ahura Mazda was a god of light, and fire was considered a sacrament. To burn somebody would be considered a sacrilege. So Darius has to use a den of lions. And of course, here again, we see an instance of a choice, obeying God or obeying man, and he chooses to obey God. But I think we see some principles here. Principles of obedience and disobedience. Normally, we obey. Second principle, we disobey only after working out, or making every effort to work out our differences. You deal with civil authorities. First of all, you agitate. Then you educate. Explain what your reasons are. Then you negotiate. Try to work it out. Then you litigate. Go to court. Then you legislate. You try to get the laws changed. Then maybe you regurgitate, but only after all that do you disobey. And when you do disobey, you do so openly. When you disobey, you know that you don't do the crime if you can't do the time, and so you accept your punishment. And even in being punished, and even in disobedience, you still show respect. Notice, after Daniel's been placed in the den of lions for the night, and King Darius comes and asks, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to deliver you? It's the wrong question. Of course he's able. He should have asked, is he willing to deliver you? What does Daniel say? You dirty rat, you shouldn't have put me in here. No, he addresses the king with the standard address that is used for a Persian king. O king, live forever. Even in disobedience, Daniel shows respect. Well, we've talked about principles of obedience and principles of disobedience. Now let's talk a little bit about the doctrine of interposition. What does interpose mean? At him come thou fount of every blessing, he to rescue us from danger, interposed his precious blood. What did he do with his blood? He placed himself between us and our sin and the judgment of God. Interpose means to place between, to stand between, and in a governmental sense, interposition is the act of lesser magistrates placing themselves and their offices between the people that they represent and the higher magistrate who has usurped power and acted as a tyrant. Rehoboam, I think, is a good example of this, and if you look back to 1 Kings chapter 12, we see where when Rehoboam becomes king, that the various tribes come to talk to him, and Israel is still somewhat of a republic, even under what I would say was the tyranny of King Solomon. Israel is still somewhat of a republic, and the 12 tribes have to ratify him and recommit themselves to him. There's an element of consent of the governed even here. And so we read in chapter 12, verse 10, that after Solomon has died, his son Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king. In other words, representatives of all of the tribes have now come to Shechem. And there in Shechem, they're going to confirm a new covenant with Rehoboam to make him king. But there's also another issue here, and that is Jeroboam, who had to flee under Solomon because he opposed the forced labor and heavy taxation that Solomon was imposing. And anyway, so Jeroboam has had to flee to Egypt, but now that Solomon is dead, he's come back. And now he is leading some of the northern tribes, and so we see that these northern tribes come, and with Jeroboam, they speak to Rehoboam. And in verse 4, they say, "Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighter, and we will serve you." And Rehoboam says, "Come back in 3 days, I'll consider it." Turns to his older advisors, "What do you think I ought to do?" "Well, we think some tax relief would be appropriate at this point. Solomon had made things pretty heavy on us, and if you would agree now to lower taxes and so on, I think you'd cement the loyalty of these people and unite the kingdom." Okay, younger advisors, "What do you think we ought to do?" "This is the time you got to show your authority. Give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Now you got to really clamp down on them." And he says, "You're right." And when they come back, he says to them, "My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Where he has chastised you with whips, I will chastise you with scorpions." 300% tax increase, effective retroactively. And the representatives of the northern tribes say, "What have we to do with the house of David?" There's always some resentment here that Judah has become the repository of the kingship instead of the firstborn, Reuben. "What have we to do with the house of David? To your tents, O Israel," and the 10 northern tribes secede. And Israel from that point on is a divided kingdom. Now that tells us what happened. It's not necessarily telling us it's what ought to happen. Were they right in doing so? Well, we see that King Rehoboam puts together his army to go up and subjugate the northern kingdom. Now, how can Rehoboam, who really now has only 2 tribes with him anymore, Judah and Benjamin, how can he come up and subjugate the 10 northern tribes? The answer is that since the time of Solomon, Israel now has a standing army. Prior to that, they were defended by militias raised from each of the 12 tribes, but now Solomon and now Rehoboam have a standing army. But we read that a prophet of God meets him and says, "You are not to go up against the north, because what they have done is of God." And Rehoboam agrees. So there's a good example of interposition. Another good example of interposition, as you see through history, is the Magna Carta, where after you have the good rule of Richard the Lion-Hearted, although in his 10 years as king, Richard spent only about 6 months in England. Most of the rest of the time he was either in France or out on crusades, and he wasn't using email or texting to keep up with what was going on. And so there were a lot of problems, and his brother John was ruling in his place, and John had become a tyrant. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who probably was of Viking ancestry living up north of the Danelaw, he gathered together the bishops and the barons, and he instructed them in this doctrine of interposition and drafted or helped them draft the Magna Carta, which recognizes the God-given ancient rights of Englishmen as well as the independence of the church. And there in June of 1215, they meet King John and his supporters there at Runnymede. And they basically say to him, here's a document in which you would agree to respect our rights and the limits on your government. You either sign this, or you're going to be looking for a job. And we're not going to give you good recommendations. And in the newspapers of Europe today, we're not seeing a whole lot of want ads saying king wanted. Well, John signs. And the Magna Carta is not that radical a document. In fact, in many ways, it's a reactionary document, simply going back to the ancient rights of Englishmen, which in the Anglo-Saxon days and the Celtic days before that they understood and respected, and are now being violated. But what is really significant about the Magna Carta, it is the first time in recorded English history that a king is required to sign such a document with the threat that if he doesn't, he's going to be thrown out of office. That is interposition. Now, right around this same time, we find Thomas Aquinas talking about the doctrine of interposition and calling it the right of tyrannicide. That's not a species of dinosaur, that's killing a tyrant. But also, around this time, or actually a few hundred years later, we see Luther. And some will tell you that Luther believed in absolute obedience to the civil government. It's simply not correct. In fact, in the Augsburg Confession, which is to Lutherans what the Westminster Confession or the Heidelberg Confession would be to Calvinists, in the Augsburg Confession, Article 16, it says that we are to obey civil government, except when government commands what God's word forbids, in which case we must obey God rather than men, quoting directly there out of Acts 5:29. But Luther himself, well, when we look to Luther, he himself, his whole ministry really was based on interposition. You recall that he stood before the Diet of Worms, and Diet is a council, and Worms is a city. Diet of Worms could sound like something not too appetizing, in other words. But as he stands before the Diet of Worms, and he says, I can do no other, here I stand, God help me, amen. And then the emperor brands him a heretic and says that anyone who finds Luther must either slay or capture him. Well, now we see an act of interposition by one of the northern German princes. And one of the things I think they liked about Luther was that Luther was educated in law, but as you probably know the story that Luther, one night in a thunderstorm while he was studying law, he was afraid for his life from the thunder, and so he made a vow to St. Anne that if you will get me home safely, I'll give up my legal studies and I'll become a monk. Some of us think that maybe he made up that story because he didn't want to take the bar exam. But anyway, Luther studied law, and he studied the old Anglo-Saxon law, the old Germanic law, not the Roman law. Roman law had been imposed on most of southern Germany with the Visigothic Code, the Salic Code, and others of these codes, but in northern Germany, thanks to a great battle that took place in 9 AD, where Hermann the Liberator basically decimated 3 Roman legions and drove them across the Rhine, and the result was that northern Germany and Scandinavia were forever free of the influence of Roman law, which was centralized. Luther had been taught the old Germanic common law, not Roman law, and that's one of the reasons the northern princes liked Luther. They also agreed with many of his doctrines too, so this wasn't the main reason, but they liked him because the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were trying to impose Roman law which they were resisting, and they found Luther a very good ally. But Frederick the Wise, the Elector or Prince of Saxony, basically says to the Holy Roman Emperor, that's not going to happen, not on my watch. You're not going to capture or slay Luther up here in Saxony. And so you recall what he did. He arranged this capture of Luther and had Luther, even Luther didn't know exactly what was going on here, but he had him taken up to the castle of Wartburg on mountaintop, and Luther lived there in seclusion for a year, during which time he translated the New Testament into German. But that was an act of interposition by the Prince of Saxony against the Holy Roman Emperor. Luther's ministry was saved by an act of interposition. But anyway, Luther still believed in civil authority strongly. On one occasion he said that, God willing, I will never flatter a prince, but much less will I put up with mobs and insurrection. And so he didn't believe in rebellion in that way, but gradually his position changed, and finally, in 1539, Luther's position had solidified to the point where he is just ready to say it. And I'm looking for my place. I had it marked in here, and that's what happened. My marker got taken out, but probably by me. He says in 1539, our princes have therefore decided that in such case, His Imperial Majesty is not an emperor, but a warrior, servant, and robber of the Pope. As in the latter case, such a war is the real leader and emperor. This is the attitude of our estates. The German princes have more right as against the emperor than the people in that day had against Saul and Ahikam against Jehoiakim. The emperor is not an autocrat. It is not within his authority to depose the electoral princes and change the form and glory of the empire, and it is not to be permitted should he attempt it. He goes on to say, if His Imperial Majesty begin and wage a war for a foreign cause and in the interest of the devil, and His Majesty does not know that his cause is evil, it is nonetheless sufficient that we know it and are certain of it. Well, we see the result there with the Augsburg Confession and so on. But then later, you heard discussion here of the Magdeburg Confession, when Magdeburg is surrounded by the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor. Much of the rest of Lutheran Germany has had to surrender to the emperor, but the clerics of Magdeburg refuse, and they draft the Magdeburg Confession. There's a new edition of it that's just come out in English by Christian Preuss, with a introduction and a foreword by a very good friend of mine, Dr. Ryan McPherson of Luther Classical College. But anyway, the Magdeburg Confession is their statement of interposition against the emperor. Now, it's very significant because this is 1550. We often think that this is a Calvinist doctrine, but this is 29 years before Vindicae contra tyrannos. It is 100 years before Rutherford's Lex Rex. And in fact, when John Knox is in his confrontation with the Queen Mary of Scotland and her advisors, he cites the Magdeburg Confession and brings it to their attention. And some of them say, obviously written by ignorant and unlearned men. Knox responds, but men of God nonetheless. We could go on and talk about, I guess I'm out of time, am I not? Okay, a couple questions to ask during the question and answer period. How does this apply in the 1640s to the battle between the Puritan Parliament and the English king, who believed in the divine right of kings? Or how does this apply to the U.S. Declaration of Independence? Or how does this apply to the war between the states? Or how should it be applied today? Those are questions you can ask this afternoon.